You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
So, Chris, our fans love you. They think you're just incredible.
That's how you're going to start.
They're so intrigued by your life. We've received so many message.
Whatever.
Listen, we've received so many message asking about just the trivial things in your life. So you mentioned that I like to grill and cook.
So many messages.
So all of those card and letter we've received in the mail asking about you. Just tell us something mundane. What's your favorite food?
Oh, those card and letter.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good.
What's your favorite thing?
Okay, all right, let me get through this.
The classic meal, the best meal.
Absolutely favorite food in the world is sushi.
Sushi,
Beyond that is actually Italian food because I'm 50% Italian on my mom's side. She was an Italian cook. My wife doesn't really love Italian food. So we rarely have had it over the past 30 years of marriage. So,
Liz, step it up.
Yeah, well,
No.
I'm kind of glad now because it's pasta. It's older, right? Like, it's not necessarily good for you.
Yeah.
And then after that would be steak. All quality of steak. And then the fourth would be Mexican.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I got them in order.
Okay. So sushi.
Oh, absolutely.
So, do you like fried sushi? What's that called?
No.
When they do that?
Yeah, tempura.
Tempura. You like tempura? You like the straight up?
I like the raw.
The raw stuff. Yeah. Okay, what's your favorite?
My favorite is a rainbow roll, which is actually a California roll wrapped in seaweed and the sticky rice, and then on top of it is like an overlay of like 8 pieces. What's different, like a variety of fish.
Wow.
So like salmon, sometimes it's avocado, sometimes it's white, sometimes it's tuna, whitefish.
Okay.
So yeah, it's great.
I have a sushi story. I had never had sushi. Now, I love sushi now, but I had never had sushi before. Yeah, I grew up in Elba, Michigan, man. I didn't know. So we were in Rwanda with Rick Warren, and Rick is buying us all dinner. And he said, I'm taking you to my favorite Japanese restaurant that's not in Japan. And he said, they have incredible sushi, which is really weird because Rwanda's a landlocked country, but It was his favorite restaurant. So he's paying. And then what he did is across from each of us, he left an empty seat so he could just come down and talk to each of us. So I said, Chad, I want sushi, but I don't even know what to order. And Chad loves sushi, Chad Asman, our executive pastor. So he says, well, I'll just order for you. So he ordered 3 different sushi rolls. And then I ordered some steak on the side just in case I didn't like the sushi. They delivered it just as Rick was coming to sit down and talk in front of me. But the rolls were like 4 inches across, and they were like a foot long, each of them. And they set them all down in front of me, and Rick was like, wow, you really like sushi. And I'd never had it before in my life. Now I have to eat it. Doesn't matter.
Right.
I have to eat it.
Right.
And he's paying for it, and it looked like I just like, oh, Rick's paying? Shoot, bring it all to me, right?
Right.
I was so embarrassed. But it turns out I really like sushi. So that's good. You guys taught me. But of course, you've never taken me to sushi.
No. Well, but by the way, if you here's what I heard in that message. I heard Jeff will go to dinner with you as long as you're paying.
That's exactly. That's my favorite way to go to dinner, I'll tell you. Okay, so we're introducing this lady named Deborah. She's one of the great female leaders in the Bible, and you find several key female leaders in the Bible, that had big impact on the people of Israel. But she has maybe one of the coolest stories surrounding her. And so let's just dive in. We're going to read Judges chapter 4. Her story is in chapter 4 and chapter 5. And we'll just read the entire chapter 4, if that's okay.
Sure.
After Ehud's death, the Israelites again did evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord turned them over to King Jabin of Hazor, I don't know, a Canaanite king. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. That's what it says, Harosheth Hagoyim.
Sorry.
Yeah, you laugh. No, you don't have to read it.
By the way, let me just pause and say this. I always just, when I sometimes read through this, I'll sometimes say, who lived in, that place.
Yeah. So I'm gonna give it the old college try. Sisera, who had 900 iron chariots, ruthlessly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help. It took them 20 years to ask God to help them. Deborah, the wife of Lapidoth, was a prophet who was judging Israel at the time. She would sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites would go to her for judgment. One day she went for Barak, son of Abinoam, who lived in Kedesh in the land of Naphtali. She said to him, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. Call out 10,000 warriors from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun at Mount Tabor, and I will call out Sisera, commander of Jabin's army, along with his chariots and warriors to the Kishon River, and there I will give you victory over him." Barak told her, "I will go, but only if you go with me." "Very well," she replied, "I will go with you, but you will receive no honor in this venture, for the Lord's victory over Sisera will be at the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, and at Kadesh Barak called together the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 warriors went up with him. Deborah also went with him. Now Heber the Kenite, a descendant of Moses' brother-in-law Hobab, had moved away from the other members of his tribe and pitched his tent by the oak of Zanemin near Kadesh. When Sisera was told that Barak, son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, he called for all 900 of his iron chariots and all of his warriors, and they marched from Harosheth Hagoyim to the Kishon River. See what I just did there? Mm-hmm. When Sisera was told that then Deborah said to Barak, "Get ready. This is the day the Lord will give you victory over Sisera, for the Lord is marching ahead of you." So Barak led his 10,000 warriors down the slopes of Mount Tabor into battle. When Barak attacked, the Lord threw Sisera and all his chariots and warriors into a panic. Sisera leaped down from his chariot and escaped on foot. Then Barak chased the chariots and the enemy army all the way to Harosheth Hagoyim, killing all of Sisera's warriors. Not a single one was left alive. Meanwhile, Sisera ran to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because Heber's family was on friendly terms with the king Jabin of Hazor. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come into my tent, sir. Come in. Don't be afraid." So he went into her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "Please give me some water," he said. "I'm thirsty." So she gave him some milk from a leather bag and covered him again. "Stand at the door of the tent," he told her. "If anybody comes and asks you if there's anyone here, say no." But when Sisera fell asleep from exhaustion, Jael quietly crept up to him with a hammer and a tent peg in her hand. She then drove the tent peg through his temple into the ground, and so he died. When Barak came looking for Sisera, Jael went out to meet him, and she said, "Come, and I'll show you the man you're looking for." So he followed her into the tent and found Sisera lying dead there, with the tent peg through his temple. So on that day, Israel saw God defeat Jabin, the Canaanite king, and from that time on, Israel became stronger and stronger against King Jabin until they finally destroyed him.
What an unbelievable and epic story.
Wow. So we used to call that story Jail with a Nail.
Jail with a nail.
Jail with a nail. That's what we used to say.
That's a big old nail.
Yeah, that's a big
one.
one.
To go through somebody's head.
Well, so the women were responsible for setting up tents, right? So women often were in that day were treated like property. So she was more than familiar with a hammer and a tent peg, and she was more than capable of taking care of this bad guy. So, yeah, man, there's a lot in this story.
Yeah, there's a lot. Hey, can I just, since we're already talking about the gross part of it, you know what I think is interesting is that he asks for water and she gives him milk. And a mother would know that warm milk would make you sleepy.
Yeah.
And so it shows that Jael is not only more than capable of swinging a hammer, but she's also very wise.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it also indicates that she had the intention of, like, number one, she recognized who this guy was. She's like, "Oh, come on in, you'll be safe, Yeah. I'm just a woman, I can't harm you." Right? Just sort of knowing all along that she was going to, rise up as a warrior. She gives him
some warm milk and some cookies.
Yeah.
Go to sleep.
Sweet
covers
little
him.
Jael.
She covered him with a blanket.
Or a sweet little, whatever his name is.
Yeah, Sisera. She tucks him in.
Right.
She gives him warm milk, probably
Right.
some cookies. She sings him to sleep, and then she drives a nail through his head.
I always picture she drives the nail through his head, and then he tries to run, and then he just sort of goes in a circle.
But that's not what happened.
That's not what happened.
That's not what happened.
No, I don't think so.
So her husband was an ally of the bad guys.
Yeah.
Perhaps her husband was the one who told them where the Israelite army was, because it says that he was informed. And then Sisera takes his armies up and his 900 chariots. The chariots of that day were the tanks of that day.
Right.
So to have 900, this is probably the most powerful army in that whole region at this point. And then those chariots, it was not uncommon for the Philistine chariots and for the Moabite chariots and all these different groups, the Canaanites, they would put different weapons on the shafts of the wheels. Oftentimes they'd have swords or some kind of razor sharp thing, just so that they would go and, maim. They'd just go riding through the battle and just maiming all the foot soldiers.
Which we saw in Gladiator.
Oh, there you go.
In the movie Gladiator, it did the same thing.
Yeah.
The chariot would pass by the person and bad things
just
happened.
maim them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, Israel.
Or the hubcaps in Greece.
The movie, not the country.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Good call. Yeah.
Okay. So the Israelite army they were footmen. So there was no hope that they could stand against them. So when you see this, they've been sinning against God after Ehud had died, and for 20 years they're being oppressed.
Yeah.
By these Canaanites, and then finally, after 20 years of misery, they finally call out to God. And I just think, how often do we sit in our misery? How often do we sit under oppression of our sin? How often do we just not make any move? Whether we're talking about recovery or something, we just wait around hoping things will get better instead of taking action. But finally, after 20 years, they come to their senses and they say, the only one that can rescue us is God.
Yeah, all along. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and we spend years and years and years of our lives sometimes, wasted because we don't go to God first.
Right.
And and by the way, we have to point out the fact that Barak didn't believe Deborah. Deborah said, if you do this, God is going to give you the victory. Mm-hmm. So Deborah is the judge. She's the one who speaks on behalf of God. And so she tells him, this is what's going to happen and you will get victory. And then he says, well, I'll go, but only if you come with me.
Yeah.
Right. So in other words, he's doubting himself. He's doubting probably even the promise. And he says, I know if you're with me, then I'll feel safer. And so what did she say to him? She says, well, okay, I'll go with you. Mm-hmm. But because of your lack of faith, because you doubted, because you don't trust the Lord, then the glory is not going to go to you as a military commander.
Right.
It's going to go to a woman.
Right.
And which is great. It's great because I love the fact that it went to a woman. I just do. Mm-hmm. I just love it. But it's great also because there's a lesson here for us today. So when God asks us to do something, a lot of times, we'll say, like Peter stepping out of the boat. Well, I'll step out of the boat. Just give me a surfboard. I'll do it. Mm-hmm, like if it's just conditional on God's.
Guarantee me that I won't have any other problems, and I'll do what you tell me to do. Right? God did guarantee in this situation.
Right.
He did. She'd already said, God will go before you, and God will give you the victory. Not might give you the victory, or perhaps God will show up. She said, God will give you the victory. What we have to remember is that God's commandments are God's enablements. Right? So when God commanded him to do it, he was already enabled to do it, right? And instead, Barak's request that Deborah accompany him, I understand it on one level. She was so phenomenal, right? She was a judge. She was a warrior. She was a prophet. Turns out later on in chapter 5, she's a poet and a musician. The Bible records, so many great things about her. The people looked to her for wisdom. They looked to her for guidance, both spiritually and in civil situations. She was just amazing. She was the best person God could have put in charge of Israel at the time. And so, God always has perfect plans. And in this situation, God chose his general. God chose the place for battle. God determined what the battle plan was. It was all worked out, and he guaranteed the victory. So Barak was completely enabled as the general of Israel's army, of this army anyways, to be for victory. And still, he had an obsession, perhaps, with human effort, and he totally overlooked God's promises. So as a result, she says, okay, yeah, I'll go with you, but a woman's going to get the victory, not you.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, and it could be he just didn't understand it. He just like, hey, I don't understand all this God stuff. All I know is whatever you're a part of works. So I need the comfort. I need the security blanket of you.
Yeah. He was using her as a good luck charm.
Yeah.
This is what I'm. This is one of the issues I think that we have, but certainly you see it there. They want God to bless them. They just don't want a relationship with God. He was a man of things and of substance that he could touch, but he was not a man of faith. And she was saying, "Don't you understand? The only victory is coming in faith. So it's not going to be you. It's going to be a woman that brings that victory."
That's great. And then, of course, God does something unexpected. So just like we're going to, read, in next week's podcast about Gideon, something absolutely supernatural happens, and God causes the army to have anxiety and worry and fear.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden they just stop and they abandon their chariots.
Yeah.
So much so that Sisera runs and he goes and tries to find a place to hide. And then, of course, without their tanks, without their chariots, they're able to be overcome immediately.
Yeah.
So who would have ever thought?
Well, you have the king and you have the king's general, Sisera.
Mm-hmm.
They had, with their 900 chariots, they trusted their chariots. With their 900 chariots, they had no problem dominating Israel for 20 years. And then in this instance, you want to understand how confused they were. 20 years of absolute dominance, and in this one battle, God had set them up. They walk into the trap, and they now this dominant general is running and hiding in a woman's tent. Now, the reason why this would make a lot of sense would be strangers would never go in a woman's tent. Never. I mean, it was the family will kill you for this, right? So she invites him in. She's a friend of the family, right? So her husband is friends with this king. So he goes, "Oh, okay. Nobody's ever going to look in here, right? They're never going to go in." So he thinks he's going to be safe in there. So on every level, the shame that God brings in this defeat is you're not in your chariot. Now you're running for your life. You're hiding in a woman's tent. And then eventually he gets killed by this woman in such a major patriarchal society. It was every level of that just added on, heaped on the shame. So not only did God bring victory for Israel, but he severely punished and shamed the enemies of Israel, right? And it was all God's victory, 100%.
Yeah. And then also let's talk about the fact that God used Jael in a way that was just like he would a great warrior in the battle. Yeah. So she steps up, and again, she displays cunningness. She displays bravery. She is able to just take him out. And then, of course, she doesn't necessarily, it doesn't say she brags about it.
No.
She doesn't. She just says, "Come over here," and she brings him in, and they find him dead.
Yeah.
And can you imagine their reaction? They were like, "You did this?
Yeah.
You did this?" And it wasn't the fact that she probably was just, a woman who didn't have any, warrior skills. It was the fact that it was totally unexpected, and yet there's no indication that she didn't have any confidence. I just picture her as a person who said, "Oh, I'm going to take advantage of this, and God's going to use me for something great."
Yeah.
And so I think, man, that is such a great lesson for us. We don't think that we're going to be a part of it, but God can use us not just for great things that go unnoticed, but maybe even God's going to surprise us and let us be a part of something absolutely huge.
Yeah.
And you know what? I think of all the stories that I hear about, like, every great movement. You talk to the leader, and most of the time the leader will say, "We didn't set out to do a great movement.
Right.
All we were doing was just doing this, and then God just did something great."
Right.
And think about all those stories you've heard throughout your lifetime. They didn't seek to do something great, but you know what? God did use them for that.
Right.
And I think, man, that we never know what's around the corner for us.
It was such an odd thing that God would have a woman be a judge. That had, as far as we know, that had never happened. It certainly was it was counterculture to what they were accustomed to. So it's very unexpected, but Deborah teaches us to focus on what we can do rather than what maybe other people would tell us we can't do or shouldn't do. It's the same thing with Jael. Jael it would have been very easy for her to blame cultural norms for the reason why she was so oppressed. I think we live in a society that promotes victimhood very much, and people always have a reason why they can't succeed, or why somebody else is holding them back, or somebody else is the reason why I can't ever really be what I should be, or other people have advantages I don't have, so I can never live up. Here's a woman, Jael, and a woman, Deborah, who neither one of them would have been naturally respected in society. But Deborah rises up as a judge, as a warrior, as a poet, as a musician, as a spiritual leader, and the people respect her, regardless of what would be the norm. And then Jael steps up. Her husband already had an opinion. I'm for the bad guys. Right? And she's like, well, I guess I'm not, hey, go stand over there, Jael. Stand by your tent. Let the men do their thing,
Right.
And she's like, no, I've got my own opinions. I'm going to worship God. I'm going to honor God. I'm going to fight for God and for God's people. And so instead of being a victim of her circumstance, she stepped up, grabbed what was available. I've got some milk and a blanket, going to tuck this bad boy in. I'm going to nail him to the floor. And that's exactly what she did, right? Yeah. She wasn't a victim. She lived within her culture. She lived within her circumstances, but she overcame them rather than blaming them. And I love that. That's what both of these women do. And I think that's some of the greatest lessons for us to learn is to don't be victims, serve God where you're at, in the circumstances you're in. Yeah,
so before we close, I just want to throw in one last thought, and that is, I hope our listeners aren't assuming that it was God who set the culture of women having no rights.
No.
It was the culture of the day.
Right.
And it was almost sort of the same way when Jesus came on the scene in the first century. And what did Jesus do? Jesus honored women. Jesus elevated women. Jesus went radically counterculture and added value to women.
Right.
And here's probably the biggest: women were first at the cross and first at the tomb.
That's right.
Right. So Jesus always elevates women, and it's just because the culture exists in this story and in other stories where women are lower than men. It didn't mean it was right, and it certainly doesn't mean that's the way God wanted it.
Yeah, God's not endorsing this. God's just telling it like it is.
Right.
Right. So the book of Judges is being written as a historical fact, and this just happened to be the historical circumstances. But he's not endorsing that this is the way it should be.
That's right.
As a matter of fact, he's on purpose making sure we understand who Deborah was and Jael were, right? He's celebrating these women in this situation.
Yeah, it's kind of like slavery in the Bible.
Certainly.
The Bible mentions slavery, doesn't endorse it.
Right. That's right.
So
there's so many things like that. Just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean God's saying it, that it's a good thing. He's just recognizing this is the human condition.
Right.
And that's why I was celebrating the idea that the women rose up and overcame it rather than just being victims of it.
That's great.
It's fantastic.
All right. So Monday we will talk about Gideon, one of my favorites in the book of Judges. I love the story.
We're going to have to linger on Gideon, right? There's a lot to his story, and then we'll also get into Samson's stories.
That's great.
There's a couple other judges that we're going to look at too. But it's going to be cool.
All right. Well, we'll see you then.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.